Hello and welcome. You're watching Business Plus. We are hours away from the government's final budget before their tenure ends later this year and the country goes into polls. This is an interim budget, a vote on account, which means that the expectations are generally muted this time around. In the past 10 years, the government has aimed for stronger economic growth, driving by boost to manufacturing, domestic and foreign investments in India. Among notable policy measures, the government introduced PLI scheme in 14 sectors, a goods and service tax regime via GST implementation, reduced corporate taxes, improved ease of doing business and brought about FDI policy reforms. Bolstered by intent and action in the last 10 years, India overcame the UK to become the fifth largest economy in the world, from 10th to 5th in a matter of 10 years. It is projected to become the world's third largest economy in the coming years. To take that spot, India is targeting a $5 trillion economy by 2025 and a $7 trillion economy by 2030. It's not an easy road ahead. Simple mathematics will tell you that India needs to grow at double digit to reach the $7 trillion target at a time when the world economies are stuttering with geopolitical headwinds and expected to grow at barely 3.1% in 2024, lower than is his historic averages of 3.8%. At a time like that, can India clock a double-digit growth? And what can government do to ensure continuity in sustained growth path? To discuss that, just about close to 12 hours before budget, with me is my senior colleague R Sridharan. Also with me is Kartik Malhotra. Shri, I want to come to you first. I think the big question is, what can the government in fact do to sustain that economic growth path? Just yesterday, IMF revised its growth projections for India at 6.7% for this financial year, as opposed to government's own assumption, NSO's own data, an assumption of 7.3%. Now, given between 6.7 to 7.3%, if that's the growth path India is going to take, do you think a $7 trillion dream is even feasible? And what should the government do? What should be its key priorities area in the budget?
So there are two parts to this question of yours, Shweta. One is, of course, what is it that the government can do? What is in the government's hands that it can do? And what are the things that the government can't control? So first, of course, is the fact that the government can keep up its public expenditure, because that's the one which has really been driving our economic growth in the face of either stagnant or even falling private sector investment. There's not much of gross capital formation that's happening in the private sector. It's slowed down significantly. So it's the government expenditure, notably in the road infrastructure and railways, which has actually kept the economy going at the pace it's growing. The factor which the government can't control come from outside of the environment, which we operate in, which is the global environment. We have a conflict happening in multiple places in the world, especially in the Middle East, which is a very important source of oil. So even a sudden spike, let's say, in oil prices could actually derail a lot of your plans. So it is a very tricky situation right now. So the best that Nirmala Sitharaman, the finance minister, can hope to do tomorrow is to make sure that the policies which have kept the growth going so far are at least protected, and the government's own ability to spend on infrastructure, that is protected. But that again is a big question. We can discuss that later, because I don't want to give you a very long answer to this question. But it's not an easy thing, Shweta, to hit 7 trillion in a short time.
Not an easy thing at all. And let's talk about, Kartik, some of the things that the government can do, and that is to bolster consumption, of course, and up its spending. Now, the capex spending in the last fiscal year was to the tune of 10 lakh crore rupees, about 3.3% of the GDP. That's likely to go up to 3.4% this year. That is what the government is doing. But what should and what is keeping India from achieving that dream? You did that math that I was talking about, and the numbers are not quite adding up at 7%.
The numbers are not great. I mean, the numbers have been okay so far. And, India being the bright spot or the shining star, all that we've heard, and we have sort of, stuck with it. But, I think what I really want to draw your attention to right now, Shweta, is the fact that there is my favorite GDP calculation formula, right? And that formula is something that, I keep referring back to. So what is the formula of calculating GDP? Y, which is the definition of GDP or how it is denoted, is equal to C plus G plus I plus X minus M. Consumption plus government spending plus investments, both public investments and private sector investments, and the net exports. Consumption story is stacking up fairly well at 60% plus of the GDP, right? It was in the range of about 57%, 56%. Even despite those 2 bad years of COVID, we've been able to take consumption, private consumption up to about 60% of the GDP. So that is good news. Now, the next, of course, is government spending. Government spending or government expenditure on schemes, on SOPs, on incentivizing, free ration schemes, for example, or doling out cash to, direct beneficiaries,
farmers,
etc.
women.
Farmers, women, poor, youth. I mean, those are the constituencies of the government that we can talk about later. But primarily what the government doles out is the government's expenditure.
Right.
I think that needs to be curtailed. Government investments definitely need to keep ticking because you need the infrastructure, and we know the multiplier effect of infrastructure. It leads to job creation. It leads to easier transportation of goods. It leads to easier migration for work from place A to place B, etc. And overall infrastructure being built today is going to serve us for many, many years. But an expense incurred today is going to offset itself and its utility within the year itself. So we have to definitely look at the consumption story going. We have to look at investments, government investments, yes, also private sector investments, and at some point, we've got to reduce that oil import bill, and we've got to shore up our export capability, not be dependent on the IT sector, because that, like Shri said, is outside the purview of the government's control because of the demand from outside. But our own manufacturing to stay in sync with the requirements of the world outside, and we start delivering that, then at least 3 out of the 5 components of the GDP definition
will
should
be taken care of. Absolutely. And since we are just about 12 hours away from budget, Shri, I think everybody would want to know what can we expect. No big ticket announcement. Finance Minister has made that very clear.
That's
As
true.
I said, it's an interim budget. So, of course, all eyes would be whether there are going to be beneficiary schemes or schemes to directly benefit us, the people of this country. That may not happen. But, I think the expectation is what possible path this government will chart out for India in this year.
So, both the Prime Minister and the FM previously have hinted what might be in the budget in terms of the beneficiaries, so to say, the 4 classes of people, farmers, women, youth, and, the poor. So, I think we will definitely see some schemes and some incentives aimed at women, that's for sure. But, I want to, remind our viewers that how fragile our income tax, collection really is. Just 7% of our, adult population actually pays income taxes, Shweta. And, just 3% of the income taxpayers account for 76% of the income tax collection. So there is a desperate need for us to broaden this
tax base.
In fact, I was reading some data. There's a 33% drop in the number of people filing income taxes because they're now outside of the limit. So the rebates have taken them out of the income tax payer categories. They're exempt. So this is not a healthy situation for a country, especially one that is looking to invest in infrastructure and all the other critical areas. And we also have the need of people. Kartik talked about subsidies and doles given to people. Well, that's the reality of our economy. I mean, this is ultimately a large number of people have come out of poverty, but millions more remain in poverty. We need to bring them out. So unless the government is able to expand its income base and have more money for where the investment is needed, I think it's going to be a big challenge. The other point we should remember is that the headroom available also for government to keep borrowing is very limited. Right now, out of the 100 rupees that we collect, the government earns, 41 is going towards paying your interest income, right? And the government is committed to lowering its fiscal deficit target as well. We're talking about maybe 5.4% in 24-25 compared to 5.9% for 23-24. So, and if the government borrows, then, the interest and the costs go for all of us. All of us end up paying more on our housing loans, our car loans, everything. So it's a very complex, a delicate balance that the FM needs to walk between populist expectations and the economic rationale and the economic imperative that we need as a country today.
Okay, will it be populistic? Will it be more fiscally prudent? What is the path that Finance Minister will take tomorrow? I think all eyes will be on that, Kartik. But it's an interesting thing, interesting analogy. On one hand, you've got to save up so that your fiscal deficit target of 5.9% of the GDP is met. At the same time, you've got to give people more money in hand in order to bolster consumption. How do you really do that? And all in line, keeping with the fact fact that India needs to grow at a certain rate. And I think those numbers were on our screens, that mathematic formula that you were talking about. If you could run us through that as well to tell us what sort of growth path are we looking at?
Sure. So I'll just go to the numbers in just a bit. But I think, Shweta, what is the biggest burden when you talk about the fiscal deficit of the government? Fiscal deficit is primarily the delta between what the government is earning and what the government is spending. I think one very simple challenge which is facing the government right now is the pension bill. So I have a feeling that in this budget, and it's not something that directly impacts the vote bank, maybe it does, Shri, I don't know, but I think there is enough room for the old pension scheme to go and the new pension scheme to be absolutely
That is very politically
ratified.
sensitive
So
comment
it is
there.
politically sensitive, I know, but
Absolutely.
most state elections are over and the pension burden is shared by state and centre both. So I think at some level we will have to reduce this burden of fiscal deficit by first rationalizing the pension scheme.
Absolutely.
Right? The second to my mind is she was talking about the abysmal number of taxpayers in the country, and even on that very small data of only 7% of the people paying taxes, you have most of the filers filing returns but paying zero taxes. So tax buoyancy needs to obviously increase, and linked very closely to that, I think, are all these exemptions which are part of the old tax regime, which could perhaps now be done away with. I think we've had that 1 year of experimenting between two tax regimes, and there are many cases, me included, where my CA, when he calculated the income tax returns for me, one pension scheme was giving me a tax refund of about 20,000 rupees, and the other tax regime needed me to pay 30,000 rupees to the government. Obviously, I chose the former. But I think if this sort of a gap exists in the system where you can hoodwink the tax authorities and not pay up because of the same income, there should be only one tax due to pay, right?
Absolutely.
Now, heading to the numbers, Shweta, if we have time for that, I think $7 trillion dream is what we are looking at by 2030. Right now, we've started FY24 at a base of 3.5 trillion. We know we are likely to grow at 7.3%. Keep IMF aside, let's stick to our own estimates. We grow at 7.5% and we reach only a figure of about $4.2 trillion by FY25, which is 31st March 2025, we reach 4.2. Now, assuming that we grow at 7% all through, we are actually reaching a figure of just about $5.5 trillion, not $7 trillion by 2030. So I took the liberty of plotting some more growth rates here, and it suggests that we know 7.3% is the stated growth rate for this year, 7% is the stated growth rate for next year. We will have to look at the next 5 years of double-digit growth, sizable double-digit growth, not in the vicinity of 10%, rather 11% for FY26, 11% for FY27, and then we are looking at FY28, FY29 and FY30 coming in at a solid 12% each for this figure to still be a little short of the $7 trillion mark. So at a growth rate, sustained growth rate of 7%, we will not be able to cut it when we talk about a $7 trillion economy. Now, even if we were to keep a growth rate of 7% constant, and this 7% constant rate, if we can move to the next page of this graphic, by FY28 we are coming very close to the $5 trillion mark. Now, with the 7% growth intact till FY28, do you know how much growth we'll have to clock in FY29 and FY30 to add $1 trillion each? We are looking at almost 20% growth. We are looking at a 19% growth averaged out between FY29 and FY30 to move from the near about $5 trillion mark to a $7 trillion economy into financial
Looks
years.
like a very far-fetched dream at the moment. A 20% growth rate at a time when some of the geopolitical problems that the government is also going to have to work around, and some of those were also highlighted in the IMF report to the tune of how much and what will be the impact of those geopolitical tensions on the world economy. Now, historically, world economies have grown at about 3.8%. This year, expected to grow at about 3.1%, which is far, far lower from 3.8%. So the idea is that world over, all economies are facing these headwinds. India, however, remains resilient. And for India to remain resilient, of course, its own manufacturing has to be robust. Its own consumption story has to stand out. What according to you, and before I close this bulletin, first to you, Shri, what according to you should be the key focus areas for the government in this budget in order to ensure that sustained growth rate?
Well, I think the key is to keep up the government investment, Shweta, because no matter what happens to private sector investment or what happens externally, if you are able to keep the expend, if you are able to keep employment growing, if you are able to keep the demand in steel, cement sector with our investment infrastructure growing, and the efficiencies that come from investment infrastructure flowing through economy, if that keeps coming, I think we would have done our job. But actually, on the larger picture, there's very little the government can do, because oil is going to be a very big uncertain question, and no one really knows how this thing is going to play out, because I think we're just maybe a badly aimed missile away from a global war in some sense, so anything can happen. It's a very fragile and delicate situation at this point.
Absolutely. Two wars, geopolitical issues, the Red Sea crisis that continues unabated. Kartik, what should be government's key focus areas tomorrow?
To my mind, Shweta, we've definitely got to make our manufacturing absolutely self-reliant. The Make in India manufacturing dream has to be given wings now. We've seen PLI, we've seen other schemes. Government data says, yeah, they have fired, not too much action on ground. So we've definitely got to get our exports outside of the IT services, which are directly, dependent on the global economic and political scenario. But we've got to get our manufacturing going. That is going to lead to job creation. That is going to increase the net base of taxpayers, and that is going to keep the consumption story also going. So I think the focus of the government has to be manufacturing.
Manufacturing, and perhaps be an alternative to the global supply chain as the world looks to China +1. India +1 could be the story panning out. Tomorrow is that key day. The interim budget will be presented at about 11 o'clock. We'll be here on News 9 with policy makers, with decision makers who will break down each crucial key data points that will be spoken by the Finance Minister tomorrow in the Parliament, right here on News 9. Keep watching.